September 1898. A young cavalry officer gallops toward 2,500 Sudanese warriors. He cannot use his saber. His right shoulder is destroyed. But he has something no other British cavalryman possesses, a German semi-automatic pistol with 10 rounds. In the next 120 seconds, he will empty the magazine and survive. 42 years later, that same man will be the only leader who dares to stand against Hitler, and he will still be carrying a pistol in his pocket, the same one he took back from his own bodyguard because he thought the man didn't deserve it. This is the story of Winston Churchill and his personal firearms, 3 Mausers, a Colt 45, and the mindset that saved the world. The story begins not with a battle, but with a boat. October 1896, the harbor at Bombay, India.
A 21-year-old cavalry officer named Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill has just arrived in the jewel of the British Empire. He is eager, ambitious, and desperate for adventure. The young lieutenant has graduated from Sandhurst. He has joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, one of the most prestigious cavalry regiments in the British Army. He is ready to conquer the world. But first, he has to get off the boat. The harbor at Bombay was notoriously treacherous. The swells could rise 4 or 5 feet in moments. Small boats pitched and rolled against the stone quays. Churchill was not a patient man. While other officers waited for the boat to settle, he decided to leap for the dock. He grabbed an iron stanchion to steady himself. The boat lurched in the opposite direction. Churchill felt his right shoulder wrench violently as his body weight pulled against his grip. He lost his hold and tumbled onto the wet stone steps.
The pain was excruciating. His right shoulder, his dominant arm, had been dislocated. It was, by any measure, a stupid accident. The kind of thing that happens to eager young men who don't have the patience to wait. But this stupid accident would change the course of history. Churchill's shoulder never properly healed. The joint had sustained damage to its capsular attachments, leaving it prone to what doctors call recurrent instability. In plain English, it would pop out of socket with alarming regularity. For the rest of his life, Churchill would deal with this injury. "It would cripple me at polo," he later wrote. "It would prevent me from ever playing tennis. It would prove a grave embarrassment in moments of peril, violence, and effort." But the most immediate consequence was this: Winston Churchill could no longer use a cavalry saber.
In 1896, the cavalry saber was not just a weapon. It was the symbol of a cavalry officer's identity. The sword was romance. The sword was tradition. The sword was what separated officers from common soldiers. A cavalry officer who couldn't wield a saber was like a painter who couldn't hold a brush. But Churchill was nothing if not adaptable. If he couldn't use a sword, he would find something better. And in the final years of the 19th century, something better had just arrived on the market. It was called the Mauser C96, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Mauser C96 was born in 1896, the same year Churchill arrived in India. It was designed by 3 brothers, Fidel, Friedrich, and Joseph Federley, working for the legendary German arms manufacturer Mauser in Oberndorf, Germany. The pistol they created was revolutionary.
Most handguns of the era were revolvers, 6-shot wheel guns that had to be loaded 1 cartridge at a time. They were slow, they were limited, and in a close-quarters fight, 6 shots might not be enough. The Mauser C96 changed everything. It was semi-automatic. Pull the trigger, and it fired. Pull it again, and it fired again. No cocking, no cylinder rotation. Just point and shoot. It held 10 rounds in an integral box magazine, nearly twice the capacity of any revolver. It could be reloaded in seconds using a stripper clip. The strategic movements of the forces toward a regional capital and the specific preparations the officer made for combat, including his preference for a modern firearm over traditional cavalry weapons. The section concludes with a description of a tactical error during a major battle, where a cavalry unit unexpectedly charges into a large, concealed enemy force. Would you like a summary of the next part of this historical account? The Lancers crashed into the massive warriors at full gallop. What happened next was 2 minutes of absolute chaos. Men and horses went down. Sabers shattered on impact. Lances snapped like twigs.
Dervishes swarmed over fallen riders, hacking with swords and thrusting with spears. Churchill found himself surrounded. He didn't try to use a sword. He couldn't have, even if he'd wanted to. Instead, he raised his Mauser and started shooting.
I rode up to individuals, he wrote, firing my pistol in their faces and killing several, 3 for certain, 2 doubtful, 1 very doubtful. One dervish got so close that his curved sword actually bumped against the barrel of Churchill's pistol. Churchill wheeled away at the last moment and galloped clear. Behind him, the 21st Lancers were fighting for their lives. The charge lasted approximately 120 seconds. When it was over, 1 officer and 20 men of the 21st Lancers were dead. 4 officers and 46 men were wounded. 119 horses had been killed or injured. Of the 28 British soldiers killed in the entire Battle of Omdurman, 21 were from this single charge. Churchill emerged without a scratch. He had fired exactly 10 shots, the full magazine of his Mauser, but without a hair of my horse or a stitch of my clothing being touched. Very few can say the same, he added.
That night, Churchill wrote to his mother. The pistol, he told her, was the best thing in the world. Churchill returned to England a celebrity. His dispatches from the Sudan had been published in newspapers across the empire. His book about the campaign, The River War, would become a bestseller. And he had a new appreciation for the Mauser C96. On November 1, 1898, Churchill walked into the offices of John Rigby & Co. in London and placed an order. He bought 2 more Mauser pistols, serial number 4257, serial number 2373. The bill came to £15 and 2 shillings, roughly £2,000 in today's money. This included the pistols at £5 5 shillings each, 1,000 rounds of ammunition, a tin-lined cartridge box, and a pistol case. Churchill, who was perpetually short of money, didn't actually pay the bill until May 1901, nearly 3 years later, but he took delivery immediately.
Why 3 Mausers? The historical record doesn't give us a definitive answer, but we can speculate. One possibility, Churchill understood that in combat, weapons fail. They jam, they break, they get lost. Having a backup, or 2, made sense. Another possibility, Churchill was planning ahead. He knew that his military career wasn't over. He knew that more wars were coming, and he knew that the Mauser had saved his life at Omdurman. A third possibility, Churchill simply loved the weapon. He was, throughout his life, a firearms enthusiast. He appreciated fine engineering, and the Mauser C96 was, by any measure, a masterpiece. Whatever his reasons, Churchill now owned 3 of the most advanced pistols in the world. He would need them sooner than he expected. In October 1899, war broke out in South Africa.
The conflict pitted the British Empire against 2 small Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, whose Dutch-descended settlers refused to accept British sovereignty. Churchill had resigned his military commission earlier that year to pursue a political career. He had run for Parliament and lost. But when war came, he couldn't stay away. He sailed for South Africa as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, earning the enormous salary of £250 per month plus expenses, and he brought his Mauser. Churchill arrived in Cape Town in late October and immediately headed for the front lines in Natal, where British forces were under pressure from Boer commandos. On November 15, 1899, he boarded an armored train for a reconnaissance mission toward the town of Chivli. It was a decision that would nearly cost him his life. The armored train was a disaster waiting to happen.
It was slow, noisy, and confined to the rails. It couldn't maneuver. It couldn't retreat quickly, and it announced its presence to every Boer commando within miles. A few miles north of Frere Station, the Boers sprang their trap. They had placed boulders on the track. When the train hit them at speed, 3 wagons derailed. Then the Boers opened fire with field guns and rifles. Churchill was technically a civilian, a war correspondent with no military authority, but that didn't stop him. For over an hour, he organized the effort to clear the track, completely ignoring the bullets and shells exploding around him. He helped load wounded soldiers onto the locomotive, which eventually escaped back toward Frere. Then, Churchill made a fateful mistake.
Instead of staying on the locomotive, he went back to help the soldiers still trapped at the wreck. He found himself alone in a gully, separated from the train. A Boer horseman appeared, raised his Mauser rifle and shouted, "Surrender or I shoot." Churchill reached for his pistol. It wasn't there. In the chaos of the battle, he had left his Mauser on the locomotive. He was unarmed. He had no choice but to raise his hands. The Boer who captured him was later rumored to be Louis Botha, the same man who would eventually become Prime Minister of South Africa. Churchill was marched to Pretoria and imprisoned in a converted schoolhouse. He would escape a month later in one of the most famous prison breaks of the war. But the lesson stayed with him. Never leave your weapon behind. Churchill's escape from the Boers made him a national hero.
He returned to England, won a seat in Parliament, and began one of the most remarkable political careers in British history. By 1911, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. By 1914, he was one of the most powerful men in the British government. And then came the Great War. Churchill threw himself into the conflict with characteristic energy. He championed the development of tanks.
His political career appeared to be over. But Churchill had never been content to sit on the sidelines. If he couldn't lead from Whitehall, he would lead from the trenches. Before leaving for the Western Front, Churchill did something characteristic. He bought a new pistol. Not a Mauser this time. The Mauser was excellent for cavalry charges, but trench warfare was different. It required a weapon optimized for close-quarters combat in mud, rain, and darkness. Churchill chose the Colt Model 1911, the American .45 caliber automatic that had become the standard sidearm of the United States Army. The 1911 was everything the Mauser wasn't. Where the Mauser was complex and temperamental, the 1911 was simple and robust. Where the Mauser fired a small, high-velocity bullet, the 1911 fired a heavy .45 ACP round with tremendous stopping power.
Where the Mauser was delicate, the 1911 could be dragged through mud and still function. Churchill purchased his Colt in London in 1915. It was a government model, a commercial version of the military pistol, assembled by Colt in 1914. He had his name engraved on the right side of the slide, Winston Spencer Churchill. He had a custom holster made to fit his Sam Browne belt, and he carried it to war. In January 1916, Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill took command of the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers. The battalion had been devastated at the Battle of Loos the previous September. It had lost 2/3 of its officers and half its men.
For the rest of the war, through the Blitz, through the conferences with Roosevelt and Stalin, through the darkest hours of the conflict, Winston Churchill carried his own .45. Photographs from the period show a distinctive bulge under his suit jacket, right around the hip. That was his Colt. The Colt wasn't Churchill's only weapon during the war. He kept a Thompson submachine gun, the famous Tommy gun, loaded and ready in his official car. He had his personal Sten gun, presented to him by the manufacturers. He practiced with all of them regularly. The most famous photograph of Churchill from this period shows him firing a Thompson submachine gun at coastal defenses near Hartlepool in July 1940. He's wearing a pinstriped suit and his ever-present cigar, looking for all the world like an English gangster. The Nazis used the photo for propaganda, calling Churchill a criminal and a murderer. Churchill didn't care. He knew what was at stake.
"We shall fight on the beaches," he had told Parliament just weeks before. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." He meant every word, and he was prepared to back those words with bullets. What do Churchill's firearms tell us about the man? First, they tell us that he was genuinely prepared to fight. This wasn't posturing. This wasn't theater. Churchill had seen combat at close quarters. He had killed men with his own hand. He had faced death and survived. When he said he would fight in the streets, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. Second, they tell us that he believed in being prepared. The stupid accident in Bombay had taught him that life is unpredictable. The capture in South Africa, when he left his Mauser on the train, had taught him never to be without a weapon.
Churchill carried a pistol not because he expected to use it, but because he understood that the moment you need a weapon is never the moment you expect. Third, they tell us about his relationship with technology. Churchill was not a traditionalist clinging to the past. He was an innovator who embraced the future.
When his shoulder injury made the cavalry saber obsolete for him personally, he didn't mourn the loss of romance. He found a better tool. When the Mauser proved superior to the revolver, he bought 3 of them. When the demands of trench warfare required a different weapon, he switched to the Colt. This adaptability, this willingness to embrace whatever worked, was central to Churchill's character. It's why he championed tanks in World War I. It's why he supported radar and code breaking in World War II. It's why he won.
Churchill's firearms collection was extensive. He owned magnificent shotguns from the finest English makers, Purdy, Woodward, Boss. He received rifles as gifts from foreign governments. But the weapons that mattered most were the ones he carried into danger. His Colt 45 government model, the one he carried on the Western Front and took back from Thompson, is now in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London. It shows obvious signs of heavy use. The finish is worn. The grip has been shaped by countless hours in Churchill's hand. It is perhaps the most significant personal firearm in British history. One of his Mauser C96 pistols, serial number 4257, purchased in November 1898, survives in a private collection. It was authenticated by researchers who traced it through the records of John Rigby & Co., Wesley Richards, and the Mauser factory itself.
The other 2 Mausers, serial numbers 2373 and 3511, have disappeared into history. Perhaps they were lost. Perhaps they were given away. Perhaps they sit in some collector's safe, their provenance forgotten. But their legacy lives on. History turns on small moments. What if Churchill hadn't injured his shoulder in Bombay? He would have carried a saber at Omdurman instead of a Mauser. He would have had 6 shots instead of 10. In those 2 desperate moments, surrounded by dervish warriors, the difference might have been fatal. What if Churchill had died at Omdurman? There would have been no First Lord of the Admiralty championing naval modernization before World War I. There would have been no Minister of Munitions ensuring the supply of tanks and artillery. There would have been no voice in the wilderness warning about Hitler in the 1930s.
And in May 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, there would have been no Winston Churchill to rally the nation. Churchill himself understood this. "One must never forget when misfortunes come," he wrote after Omdurman, "that it is quite possible they are saving one from something much worse." A stupid accident on a dock in Bombay led to a Mauser pistol in Sudan, led to survival at Omdurman, led to the salvation of Western civilization. Sometimes history really does turn on the smallest things. Winston Churchill died on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90. He had lived through the end of the Victorian era, 2 world wars, and the dawn of the nuclear age. He had been a cavalry officer, a war correspondent, a prisoner of war, a cabinet minister, a battalion commander, and twice prime minister.
Throughout it all, he had maintained one constant conviction: a man must be prepared to defend himself and those he loves. This conviction shaped his politics, his strategy, and his personal habits. It's why he kept a Thompson submachine gun in his car. It's why he practiced shooting into his 70s. It's why he took his Colt 45 back from his bodyguard and carried it himself. Winston Churchill understood something that comfortable people often forget. Civilization is fragile. Freedom must be defended. And sometimes the only thing standing between tyranny and liberty is a man with a gun. 3 Mausers, 1 Colt 45, and the will to use them. That's the story of Winston Churchill and his firearms, and that's how one man helped save the world. If you found this story fascinating, please subscribe to our channel.
We bring you the untold stories of military history, the decisions, the details, the human moments that shaped the wars that shaped our world. Click subscribe, hit the bell, and join us for the next chapter of history.